All right, this next example from section 0.4 is finding the sine of the angle whose cosine is x. So a couple of things that we need to consider. This is going to output an angle. It outputs an angle. Do you remember the range restrictions on these? It gives us the principal angle. It doesn't give us an infinite number of answers. It just gives us an answer that's trapped between 0 and 180 degrees. The sine of an angle between 0 and 180 degrees is going to be anywhere from -1 to 1. So those are things we need to consider when we start doing these problems. And hopefully you remember SOHCAHTOA, because that's going to be essential in doing these problems. I use opposite and hypotenuse, adjacent and hypotenuse, opposite and adjacent, instead of x, y's, and r's from the unit circle. And the reason I do that is because a lot of the times they'll throw in a variable named x. Well, this x is different than the x that they use in the unit circle. So ultimately, we're trying to find the sine of an angle. The sine is going to output opposite over the hypotenuse. The inverse cosine is going to input the adjacent over the hypotenuse. So we have two clues here. The two clues are we've got the adjacent and we've got the hypotenuse, but it was invisible. The hypotenuse is 1. All you need to do is find the missing opposite. We're halfway done with this problem before we even start. The missing opposite, still unknown, but the hypotenuse is 1. Now try to figure out how to find the missing opposite. That's right, it's a Pythagorean theorem. So we shove x, that's a leg, square it. The other leg squared, I'm just going to call it opposite. And that's the one we're looking for, equals the hypotenuse and square it. So there's two variables, but we need to solve for the opposite. That means our final answer is going to have a variable in it. I wonder if you guys remember this when Cougs taught you this last year. So the opposite squared is 1 minus x squared. When we take the square root, we put in plus or minus, okay? But that plus or minus, we're going to have to think about before we write it over here in our final answer. If the cosine and its inverse output an angle between 0 and 180, so a picture of that would be like this. What's the nature of the sine in those quadrants, quadrant 1 and quadrant 2? The sine's based on y values, and y values are positive in those two quadrants. Therefore, we throw out the -1. That happens about 95% of the time, but I still need to understand that the range of the inverse functions is going to be the domain of the next one. So we have to plan accordingly to figure out what the nature of your final answer is going to be. So we reduce that over 1, final answer, 1 minus x squared. If you ever get a radical in the bottom of a fraction that contains a variable under it, no need to rationalize. And we'll talk more about that in class.